Hello everyone! Welcome to another episode of Science Lecture video series with Sir Geronimo. Let's get started. Good day everyone! Welcome back to our lecture video series in Science 7, and in this topic we are going to talk about the components of the ecosystem. Now let us define first what is an ecosystem. So as you can see in the picture, we can see the different living organisms interacting with each other. But aside from that, living organisms also interact with their environment. And in that case, that is an example of an ecosystem. When we say an ecosystem is one of the levels in the biological organization that is composed of all communities in a certain area, including the non-living things. So as we discussed last time about the levels of biological organization, ecosystem is one of the levels. And when we say ecosystem, it is composed of different communities or different groups of populations of different living organisms that occupies a certain area where in fact they are also interacting with non-living things. That's why when we talk about ecosystem, it is composed of various communities with non-living things. Therefore, it is a certain place where living and non-living things interact. So that is an ecosystem. Now, there are two components of an ecosystem. We have the biotic components and we also have the abiotic components. In this video, we are just going to talk about first the biotic components of the ecosystem. And within the biotic components of the ecosystem, we have the producers, the consumers, which are composed of primary, secondary, and tertiary consumers, as well as the decomposers. On the other hand, when we talk about the biotic components, we will talk about the air, water, wind, soil, temperature, and rainfall. Now, let us begin with the topic about biotic components of the ecosystem. When we say biotic components, from the name itself, biotic or bio meaning life. So biotic components are the living organisms present in the ecological system or the ecosystem. So all living organisms that can be found in an ecosystem are said to be the biotic factors or the biotic components. And there are two major components of biotic factors. We have the autotrophic components and we also have the heterotrophic components. So we are going to describe each of them in the next slides. So the autotrophic components includes all the plants and some algae that are capable of making their own food. Thus the name autotrophic. On the other hand, when we say heterotrophic components, these includes the animals, fungi, and other organisms that cannot make their own food. So the main difference between the two is that autotrophic components can synthesize or they can make their own food, while heterotrophic components cannot make their own food. Therefore, they depend their nutrition in other organisms. Let us start our discussion with the autotrophic components. They are also called as the producers. So when we say autotrophic, it came from two words meaning auto, which is self, and trophic meaning feeding or nutrition. So autotrophic components are organisms that make their own food through the process of photosynthesis in the case of plants and some algae, or chemosynthesis in the case of some bacteria. So therefore, they have the capability to make their own food without depending on other organisms. Let us have some examples of autotrophs. So they are considered as producers also because they can make their own food. Therefore, they are producers. One example of autotrophs are plants. Plants undergo the process of photosynthesis. It is a process of producing glucose, which is a kind of sugar, and an oxygen as a byproduct, using the following materials. carbon dioxide, and water with the presence of light energy from the sun. Therefore, the reason why plants can make their own food is because they can make their own food with the use of carbon dioxide that is present in the air, the water, and also the light energy from the sunlight for them to create their own food in the form of sugar, specifically glucose, and an oxygen as a byproduct that all animals also need. Thus, we can say that plants are said to be autotrophs because they are producing sugars which are also needed by animals and other organisms to have their energy also, because sugars are form of carbohydrates which are molecules needed to produce energy. Another example of autotrophs are green algae. When we say green algae, these are microscopic organisms present in bodies of water. And did you know that scientists estimate that 50 to 80% of the oxygen production on Earth comes from the ocean? And the majority of this production is from the oceanic plankton, including the drifting plants, algae or the green algae, and some bacteria that can photosynthesize. So therefore, it is not just the plants that produce the oxygen that the animals and other organisms need in order for us to survive. It is also being produced by other microscopic organisms such as algae and some bacteria. And another example of autotrophs are cyanobacteria. Cyanobacteria, as shown in the picture, are said to be photosynthetic because they contain photosynthetic parts that helps them to produce their own food. And they can produce up to 20% of oxygen in the entire biosphere. So we really do owe a lot of oxygen from them aside from the plants. And when we talk about the 20% of the oxygen in the entire biosphere, that is higher as compared to the total oxygen production in all of the rainforests around the Earth. Next, we also have the chemoautotrophs. So, instead of producing their own food through the process of photosynthesis, these organisms, such as some bacteria, can produce energy or can produce organic compounds with the absence of light, meaning to say they don't need light as compared to photosynthesis, in which they really need light in order for them to proceed. Chemoautotrophs relies only on chemical reactions, hence the name chemo, meaning to say chemical. So they undergo chemosynthesis to produce organic compounds that derive their energy from inorganic chemical reactions in the absence of light. An example of chemoautotroph is a methanogen. Methanogens are bacteria that produces methane from carbon dioxide and hydrogen. So therefore, they don't need light, but they can produce methane from carbon dioxide and oxygen, and hydrogen rather. Now, let us now proceed to another biotic component, the heterotrophic components. When we say heterotrophic components, it came from two words, hetero and trophic. Hetero meaning to say different, and trophic meaning to say feeding or nutrition. Therefore, these are all animals, fungi, animal-like protists, and some bacteria which take food from autotrophs. Because they cannot make their own food, they rely their nutrition to other organisms, to other producers, and other consumers as well. And they are considered, or they can be called as consumers and decomposers. Okay? Now, consumers. First, we are going to talk about consumers. It is divided into two factors, into two parts. We have the macro consumers and we also have the micro consumers. When we say consumers, they feed on producers and other consumers, and they cannot produce their own food. Now, macro consumers are the larger consumers, which includes all the animals that we can see. So therefore, they cannot produce their own food, including humans. Thus, they are consumers, and they are classified as macro consumers. On the other hand, we also have micro consumers, which are smaller consumers that includes the fungi and other small or other microorganisms such as bacteria that cannot produce their own food also. There are bacteria such as cyanobacteria that can produce their own food, but there are also some bacteria that they cannot produce their own food. Okay, so let us talk about the macro consumers. So macro consumers, all of us are familiar with the following terms, are composed of three different groups. We have the herbivores, carnivores, and omnivores. So, herbivores are plant eaters. Herb, from the word herb, meaning to say they only eat plants. So, they feed on plants only, such as cows, horses, goats, rabbits, and etc. On the other hand, carnivores are flesh eaters. So, they don't eat plants, but they only eat animals. So they include carnivores. Some examples of carnivores are lions, snakes, spiders, etc. And the last classification is omnivores. Omnivores are organisms that feed on both plants and animals. Examples are humans, chickens, dogs, etc. Now, did you know that a carnivore, herbivore, and omnivore can be classified according to their teeth? We can easily recognize which animal is a carnivore, an herbivore, or an omnivore by looking at their teeth. If you're looking at the teeth of a carnivore, you will notice a very sharp ripping teeth. And they also have canines. So you can see that their teeth are sharp. On the other hand, when we look at the teeth of herbivores, they are wide grinding teeth. And mostly they are made up of molar teeth. So flattened, chisel-like. And lastly, if you're going to look at the teeth of an omnivore, you can see the both kinds of teeth. The omnivores, such as humans, are composed of both canine and molar teeth. Okay? The reason why carnivores have sharp ripping teeth is because they only eat meats. They only eat other animals but not producers. So they need to rip off those meats for them to chew it better. Whereas herbivores, their primary nutrition are the plants. And omnivores, we humans are omnivores, therefore we can eat both meat and plants. That's why we have the combination of both kinds of teeth, canines and molars, and also incisors. Now, let us talk about another component of heterotrophic components, which are the decomposers. So the first component are the consumers, and the another one is the decomposers. These are considered as the micro-consumers or saprotrophs. When we say saprotrophs, they only feed on dead organic matter. They are converting those organic materials, the nutrients that they can gather from the dead organic matter, into a reusable one. They are also breaking down the complex organic material into simpler forms, which go back to the environment as nutrients that can be used by other organisms, particularly the producers. Meaning to say, the cycle goes on. So, In that case, some examples of decomposers are fungi, earthworms, and bacteria. Therefore, they feed on the dead organic matter. They are breaking down the complex materials into simpler forms that will be used again by producers for them to create their own food. Now, let me show you an interaction of organisms in an ecosystem. It all starts with a producer. A producer such as plants will create their own food through the process of photosynthesis. Now, the leaves of the producers will be eaten by a primary consumer, which are said to be herbivores in nature. Example, grasshopper. And then this grasshopper will be consumed by a secondary consumer. Example, a frog, which can eat both plants and animals. So they will be eaten, this grasshopper will be eaten by a frog. And this frog will be eaten by a tertiary consumer, example, snake. And this snake will eventually be eaten by a final consumer or a hawk. Once these consumers die, they will be consumed by the decomposers. So let's say, for example, the grasshopper didn't die or didn't eaten by the or was not eaten by the frog, so it will die in a natural scale, in a natural phenomena, so it will be consumed directly by the decomposers. Same goes with frogs, snakes, and hawk. Now, the organic materials or nutrients that will be broken down by these decomposers will be utilized again by the producers, and the cycle goes on. So those are the different interactions of organisms in an ecosystem in the form of biotic components, or the living organisms present in an ecosystem. With that, let us have our short quiz. So I will give you 1 minute to answer the following questions. So you need to identify the correct term being described for each statement. Your 1 minute starts now. So you may pause this video. After a short while, you may play it again to see the correct answers. Okay, let us now answer. Number 1, these are flesh eaters like snakes and wolves. So the answer is carnivores. Number 2, these are the living organisms that make up an ecosystem. The answer is biotic factors or biotic components. Number 3, they produce their own food from inorganic materials. The answer is autotrophs. Number 4, they depend on producers and other consumers for their nutrition. The answer is heterotrophs. And lastly, they feed on dead organic matter. The answer is decomposers. So please check your answers. If you are not correct, please take note of the correct answer. Thank you very much for listening and see you on the next video.